ערב טוב חברים, ברוכים הבאים לקבוצת ג'נסיס. הערב יש לנו את וויליאם גרדנר שילמד אותנו על הנושא של דמוקרטיה ברומא העתיקה. William Gairdner, thank you very much again for coming as usual. It's a delight and a pleasure. And tonight you are going to speak about democracy in Rome, in the Roman Empire. In Rome, sorry, ancient Rome.
Yeah, in Rome. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously it's not the empire. Yeah, thank you.
On the way to the empire.
Yes, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me again. I really enjoy being with you and your people, and actually happy that you put up with me and my layman's attempts to understand these matters. So last time we talked quite extensively about ancient Athenian democracy, and I don't know about you and your listeners, but I was quite surprised when I did all the research and wrote about that situation, because I had lived most of my adult life with misconceptions about what it was, and I hope my chapter opened some windows and threw some light on the actual situation there. And now I want to do the same in a modest way with Rome. So let's begin by saying that much of what was said about Greek society also holds true for Rome, except that everything there, was more extreme. Whether as early republic or late empire, the Roman world was a vigorous military power rooted in such a deeply slave-based society as to constitute an aberration even among the slaveholding societies of history. It's important to keep that last point in mind, because here was a society of human beings, a political society of human beings, who developed the most exaggerated and full steam slave society in the history of the world. I may have to back that up a little bit, because the Aztecs did a pretty good job of that too, and they combined that with mass cannibalism in their religious sacrifices, which the Romans didn't do, as far as we know. At any rate, Rome's early history was characterized by the so-called struggle between the orders, meaning the social orders. This is a term for an ongoing political and social turf war between elites and masses, which, in my opinion, we more or less see in every society then and since. In both civilizations, the advent of democratic thinking tended to make rights more widespread. And once these were more or less equalized within the confines of local hierarchy, there arose in reaction a ceaseless war between interest groups of the kind that characterizes modern democracy. It's true. Needless to say, masses always outnumber elites and can usually force some of their demands by revolt, or by refusing to work, or by fighting wars for their leaders. Many a Greek and Roman general was faced down by the refusals of exhausted troops. Mighty Alexander's final campaign was ended by this sort of people power, by the way. And one of the most powerful labor unions, so to speak, which had great influence on Roman policy, was composed of the multitude of rowers needed to power the Roman warships in their navy, what we would call the navy today. This sort of popular leverage, no pun intended, combined with a widespread Roman respect for the rule of law, produced over time a top-down democracy of sorts, with a responsible magistracy, regular assemblies, and a kind of political equality. By the first half of the 5th century BC, the Romans had developed two forms of popular assembly. The comitia centuriata classed the people territorially by groups of 100 citizens, hence the word centuriata. Like we say, a century in Latin is like 100 of something or other. And we still talk about a century as being 100 years. So the Comitia Centuriata classed them by groups of 100 citizens in order to manage them better. The idea was to eliminate the influence of aristocratic birth that was so common in their earlier assemblies. However, the Comitia Centuriata remained stacked against the propertyless because the wealthy and the propertied still voted first, like before them. But the Comitia Tributa was a council of the people based on tribal membership. And over time, it became the more powerful of these two committees. By the end of the 3rd century BC, this downward movement of power, which is what we're talking about here, the downward movement of sovereignty and power, was formalized in laws that marked the end of the struggle between the orders. And it stipulated that, quote, all measures passed by the tribal assembly were to be binding on the entire population, whether or not the Senate gave its approval, unquote. Again, when I give you quotes, it's not me speaking, it's some of the experts that I've used to help me in writing this chapter, and you can find them all in the notes to my book, The Trouble with Democracy. Formerly, at least, these two assemblies were now the sovereign power of the state, theoretically separate from and above the Senate. And so, quote, in form, therefore, the government was a democracy. But in fact, it remained aristocratic, unquote. And that is because the Senate contained the most capable, skilled, and educated leaders, and it exercised more actual power than ever, quote, which made its moral influence irresistible, unquote. Irresistible to the people, that is. And by the way, that was the historical emphasis of the Senates, the idea of a Senate in most modern democratic systems, before they fell into a kind of disrepute, which we often see today, is that they were made up of citizens of a higher quality, wiser, better, more thoughtful citizens. And this is especially true if they were appointed in a fair way through some system or other, whether by the leader of the country or by some government committee that had the common good in mind. And so that happened for a long time. But then in modernity, and we certainly saw this in Canada with a former leader of our own opposition named Preston Manning, whom I happen to know personally, and I differed with him on this point. He argued again and again and again and pushed the idea that Canada's Senate should be elected instead of appointed. Well, it's always been appointed. And I argued that if you're going to elect two governing bodies like that, then you're going to have a conflict of democratic legitimacy that you won't believe. And there's going to be endless squabbling between these two houses over which of the laws is more democratic than the other, and so on. And of course, the U.S. Senate used to be appointed, and then I think in about, I don't know, forget the year, 1913 or something. I don't know if I got the year right. It became elective, and they started electing senators. And so, and that's what we're seeing south of the border from Canada's perspective. Endless squabbling between these two bodies. You know, Congress trying to get something done, Senate trying to impeach the guy who's doing it, and so on and so on. And by the way, let's keep in mind that when they tried to impeach Trump, my son said, Dad, they impeached him. And I said, no, they didn't. They threatened to impeach him. In order to actually impeach him, you have to make it stand and get rid of him and, you know, take him right out of power, which they didn't manage to do. And I said, but watch out, I said, because the reasons they're using are flimsy. And the next thing you're going to know, they're going to try to impeach a Democratic president. And that's what's happening today. The Republican Congress is threatening to impeach Biden. Who knows how far that will go. Anyway, that's enough of what I have to say about the conflict of democratic legitimacies. And I argued with my friend Preston Manning, the problem we have is character, a lack of character. We're not sending people to the Senate of high character who are such good people that they refuse to be told what to do. I said, even by you. So that's the problem. We need to find people to run or to adjudicate our political system who are, so to speak, above politics. That's a lot to ask in this day and age, I realize. At any rate, the Senate in Rome was always, in practice, a council of super elite members for life. As it happened, and by the way, in Canada, senators remain senators until they're, 75 or something. Also, not true in the U.S. As it happened, where they're, elected. As it happened, the Romans developed a particular method of leading the people, while at the same time checking and limiting their influence. And now this was achieved by balancing the powers of consuls, Senate, and the People's Assembly. And, in theory at least, it became a respected prototype for people control that has pervaded the history of democracy ever since. Indeed, at their inception, both the United States and Canada, and I realize that these two countries don't have too much to do with your listeners in Israel, except the American and Canadian democracies have been called the Atlantic democracies, and there was something common to them both. They came to a continent which, as far as they were concerned, was uninhabited except by native people who knew nothing about politics, who couldn't even read, or do math, didn't have the wheel, all this kind of thing. So they just figured they were coming to a new land. And being almost all Christians, especially the early Americans, were Puritan Christians, they often referred, and in their literature you can see it time and time again, they referred to, this should touch you, they referred to America as the New Jerusalem. In other words, they were going to create a new kind of sacred society based on principles which, evolved over time. But that's how they saw the North American democracies. And so there became a kind of conflict of opinion as time went by and as history evolved between Canada and the U.S. over what the best kind of democracy would be. And I'll get to that shortly in this lecture. Yeah.
What was the percentage of Puritans in the early settlers' time?
Well, I don't know, because it's a little bit confused, but if you're ever interested about this, in this topic, there's a fascinating book. Everyone says that, what's his name, came to America in 1492, was discovered. Columbus, yes, thank you. So anyway, this fellow wrote a book called 1491. And what he was trying to do was reconstruct a history of North America before Columbus. And I was a bit surprised. I bought the book and I read it. It was just an engrossing read. I recommend it, about the New World before it was, so to speak, discovered by, a white man who was also a Christian, a deeply Christian man, who was here. And that itself is a fascinating story. And by the way, if you ever want to talk about it, I got so interested in it that I translated a book written about Canada and published in 1748 by a Frenchman named Delaporte, Joseph Delaporte. And it was called Le Voyageur Français, or the French Traveler. And I loved it. And I just stumbled on the book in, a bookshop, and I realized, I looked around, it had never been translated into English. So I did it myself. And I got involved in a lot of the early history of North America that way. Anyway, 1491 is worth reading, because you do get a sense here where, from the settlers' point of view, except for not wanting to get an arrow in the back, there were no people here that they recognized as, people they could actually connect with in terms of religion. So they tried to, convert a lot of them to the Christian religion, and they did. And the Jesuits here had an amazing and, in many ways, a troubled life here, converting North American Indians to the Christian religion. But at any rate, I would say they were all Puritans. By, say, 1620, when the Puritans came to, on the Mayflower, came to settle in America, that's often considered the first major white man settlement. But you can see that for almost 100 years before that, since Columbus, there were people here, but they were mostly hunters, tradespeople, and, people wanting furs, which they paid a lot to get from the Indians and all that kind of thing, take them over to the European market. And of course, there was massive fishing enterprises for cod in particular on the so-called Grand Banks off the shores of Canada, which is still an incredible fishing ground. I mean, they were filling their ships with cod, which they would salt on the spot to preserve them from rotting and all that, and take these huge shiploads of cod back to Europe. And this went on for virtually centuries. And it was going on when Columbus came. It's just that we didn't think of America as settled by anybody at that point. Of course, you could say it was settled by the Indians. On the other hand, the Indians were not totally. It depends where you're talking about. They were primarily migrants. For example, in Canada, the Indians would set up a camp somewhere right around where I live. They build their long houses and have about 20 or 30 families in each longhouse and all that kind of thing, and build a stockade around it so they wouldn't get killed by their Indian enemies, mostly the Iroquois. But the Hurons were the more peaceable settlers here. And but they didn't know anything really about how to work the land. So they did grow corn, maize, they called it, and things like that, and beans and all that kind of thing. But they had no system of fertilization, no system of crop rotation, and no system of irrigation. Even though many of them settled right beside rivers and things like that, they didn't work out how to divert some of the river to their fields and keep these plants watered. So they were all doing this kind of stuff by hand with little pots and things like that, corn stalk by corn stalk and so on. And most importantly, they never tumbled on the idea of animal husbandry. Why? I can only imagine why. And I have the reason I came up with is because wild game was so common. And the young men in particular loved to go out and hunt. So they would go out and hunt deer in all sorts of ways. Some of them quite nice, some of them very cruel, which we can talk about sometime. But they never conceived of the idea of just building a damn fence and rounding up some of the female deer and some of the males and getting them to make babies. In other words, breeding deer. So they didn't have to go hunt them. So what would happen was they would exhaust the area, hunt most of the animals in the area, burn most of the firewood, exhaust most of the land they were growing their crops in. So they would take the whole darn thing down, log by log, and move it all 20 or 30 miles away and build it again and do the same thing. So semi-migratory people is what the settlers saw when they came here. And, what they did was not like that. They built their farms, they built their fences, they raised their cattle and their crops. And they also had things like the wheel, which the Indians never had until the white man came. Anyway, I've digressed here, which I didn't intend to do, but you asked a question about how many were, did you say Puritans?
Yeah, how many of the settlers were Puritans?
All of them initially, but not counting the tradesmen who came here long before them just for quick visits, grab some hides and go sell them, whatever that they wanted to, tradesmen came, but they never actually settled here. The Puritans wanted to settle. And there's a famous book about that too, published in 1625, I think, called Of Plymouth Plantation. It was a group of Puritans that came on the Mayflower and settled near Plymouth Rock in the U.S. Of course, it's all sorts of stuff dedicated to that now, and the American Thanksgiving is built around that settlement. Well, a lot of them died in the first couple of winters.
Until they privatized the land, right?
Yeah, privatized the land because they had the concept of ownership and fee simple, which the native people never had. Something else, by the way, which the book 1491 makes quite clear, and it's so sad, is that the native people, and this is still true today, did not resist the white man's diseases very well. Now, then we didn't know why, but we knew it was true. So, for example, a white man would come with the smallpox and survive it. Any of the Indians who got smallpox would probably die of it, especially the children. So there's a very sad image in the book 1491 where he says from documents that in the early days, even before Columbus, if you approached the coast of America, you could smell America from 100 miles away from the fires that the Indians were always burning on the coast. And there are hundreds of little villages. They would always have fires going, to cook their food and whatever. Also to burn their enemies, too, I have to tell you. They were pretty cruel when it came to torture. And one of the things they loved to do, if they caught you, was tie you, after beating the hell out of you, to tie you to a stake right near their hair. And they would cut a strip off your thigh and hold it in the fire and then make you eat it, that kind of thing. Or make you eat your buddy's flesh or even your buddy's heart after they dug it out of him. That sort of stuff was quite common. Incredibly cruel people when it came to torture. At any rate, in 1491, he talks about how you could smell America from a long way away. So you knew you were close. And when you got close, you saw all these fires in the dark at night, all up and down the coast. But he says 100 years later, there are almost no fires because, and we don't know how many, but hundreds of thousands of Native Americans got wiped out by the various white man's diseases, smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, pneumonia, all that kind of stuff. And work has been done since on the genetics of the Indian people, and they have a different inheritance than white people do. This is still true today. And it's one of the reasons that we say in Canada that Indians can't drink. If an Indian starts to drink alcohol, it's almost like the Japanese, and I noticed that when I lived in Japan for 6 months. The Japanese can't really drink either. Their cheeks turn red in no time, and they can't really hold their alcohol very well. But Native people, it's terrible. They really fall apart with alcohol. So there was a lot of early legislation to forbid trading rum for furs and things like that, which, of course, the Indians loved their rum because they had no alcohol in their life before the white man. But once they learned about alcohol, oh man, they would kill to get it. And they'd give you any number of beautiful deer skins or buffalo hides to get an ounce of it or whatever. So the destruction of the red man by the white man is multifaceted, but the red man himself certainly played a role in it, being unable to resist alcohol and all that kind of stuff, and white men exploiting them for their fur with things like that. So it's not a great story, but, it's interesting to follow it. At any rate, I don't know how I got so far off track.
It's nice. You're a spring of knowledge. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about that. Okay, so indeed, at their inception, both the United States and Canada were all but fixated on this matter of checking and filtering the popular will through a separation and a balancing of powers, to which was added the idea of having legislators who represented the people in place of direct lawmaking by the people themselves. In other words, the idea was listen to the people because you're going to want their consent if you're going to force them to live under the laws. But keep them at bay. Don't let them make the laws themselves. That was the mood generally accepted all through the Western world at the time. And as we'll see, I don't know if I mentioned it in this bit here, but even Rousseau, who was the prophet of direct democracy in France, he said your representative style of democracy is not democracy, because once you pass the right to make the laws to another person, you've surrendered the democratic right yourself. So these are interesting theoretical issues which have an ancient provenance and which continue today. The only difference is I think people in the early days of America and Canada, the general individual knew a lot about this history, and people today don't seem to bother getting their heads into it to try to understand what the arguments are about. At any rate, in the years just prior to the end of the Roman Republic, in the midst of mob violence, there was a last effort at radical reform led by the Gracchi brothers. Now, this included armed attacks between the optimates, as they were called, that was their name for the aristocrats, and the populares, as they were called, which were their name for the democratic people, and by the Senate on the assembly. In one of these fights, the senators overwhelmed the assembly, and they murdered 300 members, like in one day, one night, whatever, and they threw their bodies into the Tiber River, which must have discouraged more than one budding politician from taking up that profession. But at any rate, it was a somewhat severe way to handle what we now see was a typical conflict within all democratic movements, namely the ceaseless effort to, I got this in italics here, to substitute those who are led for the leaders and the assembly for the Senate. And we have seen this recently in Canada. As I say, my friend Preston Manning kept arguing that the Senate should be elected. In other words, he wanted to turn it into a democratic assembly. It's exactly what was going on in ancient Rome. Or at least they wanted to disempower the Senate in favor of the former. And we see these kinds of arguments going on today. I'm sure you see them in Israel between your Knesset and whatever you call your Senate. You must have one. I don't know what it's called, but this quasi-democratic, I'm calling it quasi-democratic system of the Romans lasted until 27 BC, by which time it had become weakened in various ways and spectacularly drained by the demands of the masses to which government pandered to quell discontent. When the tired Roman Republic finally collapsed, Caesar Augustus, one of my heroes, by the way, became the first emperor in a series of absolute dictatorships that was to run for the series of dictatorships ran for more than 500 years. The productive and peaceful reign of this man, who, though he refused the status of divinity, which he was offered by the Senate again and again, in fact, ruled the people as a quasi-god. And it was a rare interlude soon referred to as the Golden Age of Rome, which is a matter of some chagrin to Democrats. But this was hardly typical. At one stage of the late empire, 20 dictators succeeded each other for reigns of no longer than 2.5 years. And 18 of them died violently at the hands of assassins or in civil wars. Onlookers must have seen this as a political system dripping with blood. By the way, earlier I mentioned Caesar. I meant to say Caesar Augustus, his adopted son, really. That was the golden age of Rome, to the chagrin of many Democrats who didn't think that a dictatorship could produce a golden age. At any rate, readers of this book may look elsewhere for details of how, from the beginning of the empire, the Roman system declined from the strongest social, military, political organization ever known, and one perhaps still unmatched in power and glory, into an unruly, worthless, and dispirited mob of dependent citizens clamoring for favors from politicians who were corrupt beyond belief. History tells how once glorious institutions became instruments for the tax plunder of the people. Oh, so you know where I'm taking this. How government centralization and equalization in the modern eroded marriage and the family, much as we see happening in the modern democracies right now. And how the political, economic, and military systems of a once mighty empire became so suffused with widespread slavery and its corrosive effects, and so beholden to the mob that hordes of aimless people without work flooded into Rome. What to do with them became the question. So to quell discontent, these people had to be fed and entertained almost on demand. At one point, some 150, get this, 150 working days, not talking about weekends here, 150 working days of every year were set aside as feast days for the restless masses. The most famous of these feast days were held in the Coliseum, which seated about 50,000 people. Unbelievable. And the Circus Maximus, this is even more unbelievable, which seated 250,000 spectators. These entertainments, or circuses as they were called, were of a size and scale and imaginative barbarity that staggers the mind. This was welfare with style. Death and sex in the Coliseum, approved by the highest authorities and administered in ways designed to titillate the bloodlust and the passions of the eager crowd, were the highlight of each show. Slaves or prisoners were often substituted for actors at the decisive moment of a dramatic performance, only to be mutilated or crucified or beaten senseless or raped or even mauled to death and eaten by wild animals, all to the roar and the goading of the insatiable crowd. The Coliseum was often flooded, get this, flooding the whole Coliseum for full-scale naval battles with ships full of prisoners who slaughtered each other before screaming fans. Like, which team is going to win, right? All this was in a city boasting the finest fruits of Roman civilization. Some of the largest of the many public baths and gymnasia, as they were called, like these were places where you went for exercise, for wrestling matches, for massages, for swimming, for hot tubs, whatever. Some of the largest of the many baths and gymnasia covered an astonishing 270,000 square feet. I just try to imagine how large that little club would be. And you could wander around there for hours and never find your friend or your wife, perhaps. And of course, there abounded bacchanalia and sexual license of a breadth and perversity never seen before, and probably unmatched. It's not a joke. Probably unmatched until the advent of the modern university campus. Although, in truth, we may be worse. For a few dollars in a feast of the flesh, not seen since Roman times, really, modern technology now beams sexual orgies and sexual perversities into the personal coliseums of, in other words, the TV sets, cell phones, iPads, whatever, of almost every home and hotel room in the modern democracies. We're actually, kids are actually able to see stuff if they want to, that only Romans saw over the last 2,000 years, generally. Think about it. What does that mean for the corruption of our democracy? So now I'm going to talk about, what did Roman democracy really mean? Well, from the beginning, the Romans forged a system in which elites from all the regions bonded together against those not part of their privileged class. And yet, unlike Athens, Rome was generous, both with citizenship. Anyone, even a freed slave, could become a Roman citizen regardless of race or birth, and with the equality under the law. If you were a Roman citizen, you had Roman protection, no matter where you were in the Mediterranean world. Romans cared greatly for liberty, which they defined, listen up, which they defined as the ability to do anything not forbidden by law. But they cared very little for democracy, at least as we understand that word. By the 1st century BC, as mentioned, the vast majority of Romans were either slaves, freedmen, in other words, former slaves, or they were freeborn men and women who happened to have slave ancestry. This alone lent enormous importance to the mere idea of the free person as someone who was not a slave. That was an essential part of their definition of freedom, was not being a slave. In other words, not being subject to the arbitrary rule of another. It wasn't just doing what you want, which is what we say today. You know, my body, my choice, and all that. No, they didn't want to be subject to the arbitrary rule of another. Okay, so all Roman citizens were equal before the law, but this did not mean they had equal political status or social privileges. Still, Roman democracy provided all citizens with certain basic rights. For the nearly 1 million voting citizens in the Italian peninsula, and remember that every citizen of the Republic had the right to vote on every law that would affect the Republic, the city had assembly spaces that could hold up to a fifth of them, even though actual citizen participation was partial and episodic.
William?
And yet, hello.
Yeah, forgive me. You said 1 million people were citizens who could vote, right?
Yeah, on the whole peninsula, not just Rome.
But if I'm not mistaken, at the height of the Roman civilization, they had about 50 million people, right? So only 1 million were able to vote?
Oh, I don't know how many they had in Rome. If you're talking about the whole Roman Empire,
yes,
that's probably true. But I don't really know, for example, how many of the citizens in what we call France today, which was controlled by Rome, actually had voting rights. I think what I'm speaking about here is what we would today call Italians, or people living on the Roman Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
In Rome, the city itself and its surround.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I have no way of checking those numbers. I take it from the experts when they tell me. So they had assembly spaces that could hold up to a fifth of them. Yet this was a democracy shaped by all sorts of informal devices designed to ensure tight elite control and to provide civic freedom without mimicking the Greek system, which of course they knew about, and all its failings. The Roman people could not have cared less, which was a shocking thing to read. They wanted only their rights and freedoms, with or without democracy. And for the most part, they got them. Indeed, there's plenty of evidence that the death of Roman democracy was ushered in by an increasingly large and active democratic body. At any rate, even under empire, the good dictators were the ones the people saw as paying full and sincere attention to the interests of the people. The dictators they deemed bad, some of whom were later judged good by historians, were often mocked at public events or even assaulted by angry mobs. The interest was in rule for the people and not rule by the people. Give us what we want, but don't ask us to provide it for ourselves. Over time, the free elites in the Roman system became an ever smaller percentage of the slave-based population. Indeed, the system of slavery had created a demographic logic of its own, a kind of revenge of the cradle, as they call it today. which eroded Roman society from the inside. It was a, quote, a sociologically bizarre situation in which a native population had been reduced to a small demographic minority by a population of servile ancestry, unquote. In the end, both the Athenian and the Roman masses demanded economic as well as political power. But because there was not much wealth to share, the Athenians were given power, and they called it freedom. But the Romans needed all political power to control their vast empire from the top, and so the people got a greater share of wealth instead, and they called that freedom. As in our modern welfare states, by the way, of which Rome was a kind of prototype. There was a gradual equating of freedom with economic security. In reality, however, most Roman citizens, quote, had no interest in participative democracy. They even feared it, for it was quite accurately identified with upper class villainy, as well as with civic and economic insecurity. They much preferred the rule of one man, with whom they identified the state, unquote. In short, they accepted absolute rule in exchange for the type of liberty they wanted: equality before the law, civic rights, and income security. And most of these things they received. In looking back at a system that went from republic to empire and from glory to decline and fall, the British statesman Lord Acton wrote that, surprisingly, the bulk of Roman literature, the good Roman literature, most of the civil law, the law of property, the mitigation of slavery, religious toleration, and a fledgling law of nations belonged not to Roman democracy, but to its period of dictatorship, and that, quote, the republic which Caesar overthrew had been anything but a free state, unquote. Again, bit of a shock, right? That's straight from Lord Acton, who was no fool. Dream Democrats who unreflectively connect democracy with liberty scratch their heads in wonder when they read that, quote, the Roman Empire, this is Acton again, the Roman Empire rendered greater services to the cause of liberty than the Roman Republic, unquote. Now that seems strange indeed, until we understand that throughout history, democracy and liberty tend to have a frequent relationship to each other, but it is not a causal or necessary one, as we're going to see. That's why I wrote this book. I have to find out what it is. So now I begin a small section called How the Modern West Saw Greek and Roman Democracy. When I say modern West, I'm thinking mostly of Canada and America, because these were the great modern experiments in democracy, which instructed everyone, including Europeans, on how this thing should or could be done, because they were all watching. From the fall of ancient democracy until the modern period, the whole notion of rule by the people had a bad name. Mob rule, tyranny of the people, the corruption of civilization were phrases commonly used in connection with democracy. If Athens and Rome could not survive long on democracy, then how could anyone else? Clearly, on the historical record, democracy was a frightening specter, a prospect of abandonment to gross and cruel passions and irresponsible desires, and eventually, under the secret ballot system of all things, to an anonymous people who could never be identified and therefore never blamed. Both the Americans, who formed their new constitution in large measure to protect society against too much raw democracy, and the lucky Canadians, who had the benefit of hindsight over the Americans, each understood that it was the will of the people that had ravaged Europe during the French Revolution and produced the predictable, quote, Caesarism, unquote, of the Napoleonic Wars. Oh boy, was it ever. They believed that history had unfolded much as the ancient philosophers had foretold. Democracy breeds tyranny, and Robespierre and Napoleon were its frightening exemplars. Best to protect ourselves against that happening again was the thinking. Now, Rome was the preferred model for America, and from the beginning, Americans have been fond of building monuments in the Roman style. Rome was perceived as temperate and wise in government. While she indeed gave the people a voice, it was a voice carefully surrounded and checked by a balancing and mixing of powers so that no single interest, not leaders, not aristocrats, not judges, and not the people could subdue the others. Together, consuls, senates, assemblies, and the courts produced a mixture that was sounder and less prone to impulsive and therefore erroneous judgment than any other formula. Belief in superiority of the so-called mixed constitution, quote unquote, which had been given its classic, if not always accurate, formulation in the 2nd century BC by the Roman writer Polybius, and you can buy his book and read it about it today, was commonplace by the 18th century. It remained for the Frenchman Charles de Montesquieu to add to this emphasis on balance a further requirement, which was to separate the functions of government from each other. He transmitted these two, he called them republican principles of government, to the Americans and Canadian founding fathers, chiefly in his book called Spirit of Laws. In addition to his admiration for the Roman model, Montesquieu almost embarrassed the proud French in expressing his even deeper admiration for the English Constitution, which he saw as a perfect mixture of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And by the way, so did the Canadian founders. I shouldn't do any more advertising here, but when I started, researching this book, The Trouble with Democracy, I wanted to know what the Americans thought about it. So I read the Federalist Papers, and I think I told you this before. I wanted to find out what the Canadian founders thought about it, but nobody could tell me because no one ever recorded what they wrote and said and argued. So I did it myself. I brought the historians and scholars together, found all the documents on microfiche stuff in our libraries across the land, and put a book together called Canada's Founding Debates, which for the first time in since Canada's beginning, actually tells citizens how the country got put together. So that's probably the only book of mine that's going to survive in the long run. At any rate, now a little bit about the American experience. Lord Macaulay, British Lord Macaulay, was chatting about the U.S. Constitution as he saw it. And he said, "Your Constitution is all sail and no anchor." That was a prophetic thing to say at that very early stage about the American Constitution, pointing to what he saw as its weakness. So let me begin on this bit. After the Revolution of 1776, and I've got that word in quotation marks, revolution, because it wasn't really a revolution. It was a war of independence against the tyranny of the motherland or England. The first 12 founding fathers, with no authority from the people, proceeded to arrange, during the summer of 1787, a meeting of 55 delegates from the various 13 states to cobble together a new constitution that was only later, and barely, ratified on a state-by-state basis. To the great surprise and despair of the original, I'm going to call them revolutionists, because Americans themselves still refer to the Revolution, when, as I say, it wasn't a revolution. They weren't asking for a different government. They wanted all the rights of which they felt England had deprived them. Like, give them back. We don't want anything different. Just give us back what we're owed. To the great surprise and despair of the original revolutionists, as I say, and even though the fathers guilefully used the language of democracy, this was never intended to be a democratic constitution. James Madison, the guiding hand of the new constitution, had set out to reverse the revolution, for the American founders were extremely distressed at the results of their newly won freedom in the 13 colonies, which had now become 13 independent states. The moment they became free from British rule, many of the legislatures of these newly independent states aggressively proceeded to do what? To raise their own armies, to institute trade tariffs against each other, to seize private property, to abolish legal debts. Farmers by the hundreds would just march into town and tell the assembly that they wanted to be rid of their debts. Why don't you pay them? No, just abolish them. Get rid of our debts. We are the people now. We can abolish them if we want to. That kind of thing. They also wanted, this is important, one of the first things they wanted to do was to abolish their senates. So each of these states had their own little sort of senate, which could overrule their little assemblies. No way, they said. We want to get rid of the Senate because we don't want anybody telling us what to do. We are the voice of the people. And of course, they wanted to reverse court judgments just because they didn't like them, or if they didn't like them. And then, not least, they wanted to print their own fiat money. And this is all historical truth. They had become, as Alexander Hamilton put it in a great and memorable phrase, quote, wretched nurseries of unceasing discord, unquote. And the founders were properly frightened at what they deemed a new elective despotism. Because nobody ever thought that if you had open and free elections, they could be despotic. But of course, that's one of the first things people can do, that they have no control on their free choice, if they gang up on the people they don't like. So they fashioned the Constitution at once to assert and yet rigidly contain democratic urges. Madison expressed, and he was probably one of the most influential founders of the American Constitution in 1787. Madison expressed the mood memorably in his Federalist Paper number 10. I recommend, because it's a great lesson for anybody in any modern nation, the Federalist Papers, because they were all working out these arguments. There's a famous paper called number 10, in which Madison wrote that pure democracies, I'm quoting him here, have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths, unquote. In sharp contrast to the Athenian system, then, which, at least for the controlling class called citizens, operated on the basis of the equal rights and public merit of all voters, the American founding was shot through with the influence of Christianity, for which the determining feature of humanity has never been innate goodness, but rather a tendency to imperfection and personal sin. Now, this formed the basis for what, in my book, I call the sinful man model of humanity. In later chapters, I developed that idea. Flawed, imperfect people can produce only flawed and imperfect institutions of government, which must therefore be designed to contain and control what? The imperfections of mere voting mortals. The practical method they chose to use to muzzle the voice of the people, one suitable for the government of such a large territory, was representation in a federal system, which they didn't call federal, by the way. They called it a general government, not a federal government, but we call it a federal system, by the best people. Now, how do you do that? Well, American democracy would be indirect. The masses would speak through representatives only, who would, quote, refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. Every one of those words, by the way, is important in the development of these early developments of American democracy, especially the word refine. This, because it was called filtration, this filtration, quote unquote, as it was called, this weighing, and above all, improvement of the views of the people was said to be for the people's own good. Excuse me, for it was precisely the uneducated, simple folk who ought not to be abandoned and crushed by the heartless democratic process of counting votes. That was a certain recipe for majority oppression of the weak, of those most in need of wise and responsible representatives to defend them. Against what? Against democracy. The result, as one somewhat cynical critic described it, was the creation of a ventriloquist democracy. Excuse me. In other words, a democracy in which the people nod and they vote in silence while their representatives put words in their mouths. So a ventriloquist democracy is kind of what we have in all the Western democracies of the modern world. Representatives are chosen by election, of course, and Aristotle had already warned, and the founders knew, that even the principle of election was in itself aristocratic and anti-democratic. As compared to what? To the Athenian selection by lot, the pure democratic means. Because it tends to favor the wealthy and the well-born and the well-educated. Election, like representation, would thus be another favored form of filtration. The new U.S. Constitution was therefore seen by the much more democratically inclined so-called anti-federalists, and they were actually anti-centralist, we would say today, as a betrayal of the spirit of the American Revolution. I am not sure that the American people, however, who celebrate their revolution and their Constitution with equal regard have ever been much aware of this dislocation at the heart of their own founding. In plainer terms, although the American Revolution was fought to get rid of such burdens as the famous, quote, taxation without representation, unquote, radical Democrats argued that the new Constitution brought these tyrannies back by substituting a powerful central government for the rule of King George III of England. And that is by subordinating states' rights to central government and by making every law of the people potentially subject to central authority and possible annulment. And of course, that is what the new Constitution did. But this whole process was designed to replace so-called Republican activism, quote unquote, in which interested citizens are supposed to shape their own future locally with imperial passivity. It meant converting the loose union of formerly separate states into a centralized internal empire, a union of individuals and not of states. Such a change effectively transferred American democracy to a purely political sphere where it could not be easily manipulated by local civil societies. Faithful to the English and the Roman models, rather than to the Greek one, at least as it was popularly conceived, the American Constitution has, despite everything, been widely admired for its structural sophistication in separating and balancing interests to block, quite successfully until very recent times, to block the concentration of power in any one branch. Many of the American Constitution makers believed that they were creating a new and improved form of what? Of the Roman Republic. However, the great paradox of our history for those still laboring under the illusion that the United States and Canada were founded as democracies, which you still hear. If I go into the street today and ask Canadian citizens what kind of system they have, they say we have a democracy. They don't know anything about what I'm telling you. So they're operating under the illusion the country was founded as a democracy. But is that the modern systems of representation and federalism have each in their own way and quite powerfully since the first quarter of the 20th century grown intensely more centralist and welfarist. They are increasingly controlled from the top down through a judicial activism, or what some call judicial federalism, that resembles more than ever the key ruling device of the republic that Plato longed for, a republic ruled by unelected judges or philosopher kings, and now in many of the democracies also philosopher queens. Excuse me. Now a bit, if I could, if I'm not wearing you out, on the Canadian experience, which has to be seen in the context of what was going on south of the border, which was a slaughter, a democratic slaughter called the American Civil War, which is probably the worst civil war, as far as we know, in the history of the world. I think over 600,000 or 700,000 Americans were killed by their own brothers, so to speak. Well, what a different lot the Canadians were from the American radicals who went to war for self-rule. Just think of the events that transpired surrounding the founding of these two federations. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, which had reached so far, believe it or not, as to set up Jacobin clubs. You know what those are. We've talked about those. Radical Jacobin clubs were set up in England and in America. And I'm still trying to find out if any of them were set up in Canada. I suspect they were, but I haven't got an historical lead yet. The Great Terror, which followed all that and which all these people knew about, followed by the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, as I say, which was the greatest fratricide in history, and all this in less than 1 century. And underpinning it all could be heard the feverish democratic rhetoric as it left lying in shambles the governments and tyrannies to which it had led. Now, that's a very strong statement, and I support it. I think it was democratic tyranny and rhetoric that led to the shambles and the disasters which I have just outlined. No thanks, said the Canadians. We have, thinking they were very special, and they say, we have an opportunity to create something better. Now, most of them were typical mid-Victorian British subjects, and they were virtually all Christian, and many with a strong evangelical basis, or bias, I should say. Or they were French Catholics who became British subjects by conquest after the battle on the plains of Abraham, where the British General Wolfe defeated the French army of Montcalm on the plains of Abraham. I argue in this book, by the time I finish it, for what I call the revenge of Montcalm, or in a sense, he got what he wanted by eventually, through the conversion of Canada's system of government to a more top-down French style of code law, instead of remaining as we should have, in my opinion, with the more British-based quasi-democratic system of democracy. So, as I say, most of them were typical mid-Victorian British subjects, most of them strongly evangelical or French Catholic. All the British and almost all the French Canadians were deeply fond, if the former, or at least very respectful, if the latter, of the British monarchy and the British Constitution, and highly suspicious of any frantic search for abstract first principles or rights, as we say today. To most of them, so much more conservative and loyalist in their instincts than their neighbors. Only God had rights. Men had duties. Canadians, said one French-Canadian founder, Georges Etienne Cassier, were certain that the great federation of the United States of America, quote, was broken and divided against itself, unquote, because it was, his words, quote, perpetuating democracy, unquote, of which the Canadians saw the defects, quote, and felt convinced that purely democratic institutions would not be conducive to the peace and prosperity of nations, unquote. Canadians felt strongly that democracy was flawed in principle because by its mere operation and logic, it creates bitter political factions, quote, brethren fighting against brethren, unquote. Cartier again remarked that in a democratic election, and this was a great quote I found of his, he said, quote, candidates came forward, and of course, each one was abused verbally and vilified as corrupt, ignorant, incapable, and unworthy by the opposite party. But one of them attained the presidential chair. He's speaking here of the U.S. system. But even while in that position, he was not respected by those who opposed his election and who tried to make him appear as the most corrupt and contemptible human being in creation. Such a system, he said, could not produce an executive head who would command respect of all the people, unquote. And at any rate, could unite only those in his own party. So all those who voted against him suddenly found themselves without a leader. But a monarch, as in the British system, and this is the French-Canadian politician in Canada supporting the British monarchy. He says, but a monarch stands for all the people and unites all the people for, quote, under the British system, a minister might be abused verbally and assailed, but that abuse never reaches the sovereign, unquote. In other words, in the American system, the head of the government also represents all the people because they vote for him. In the Canadian system, we don't vote for the Queen or the King. That's a hereditary monarch who represents all the people. We only vote for our Prime Minister. And who does the Prime Minister represent? Well, the average guy in the street will tell you he represents us, the people. And I argued with him right away. I said, no, he doesn't represent us. He represents the government that we elected, of which he is the head. He doesn't represent us. What? They don't get it because they don't know this history. Philosophically speaking, Canadians were deeply disdainful of the arrogant notion that a bit of parchment, such as the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, or the various U.S. declarations and bills of rights, could establish by fiat the marvelous traditions and concrete actionable liberties that were the inheritance of centuries of custom, centuries of common law, and centuries of cumulative experience and generations of great thinkers and statesmen. I tend to agree with them. And the Canadians tended to scorn all talk about the perfectibility of man or about his limitless what? His limitless progress, which is the word we hear everywhere today. At one time, Canada's so-called Conservative Party, I say so-called because they never were really conservative, changed their name to Progressive Conservatives. I mean, talking about, they were vomiting for the cause, honestly. These ideas were considered childishly presumptuous and unconvincing by the Canadian founders. That's a pretty big condemnation of democratic enthusiasm, if you ask me, and I think there's good reasons for it. As for the ancient model, Athens was universally rejected as so much mob rule, and even Rome, which had served America as a positive example, seemed to Canadians only negative. They sniffed at the Roman idea of separating and balancing powers, now transplanted to America as what they called a complicated assemblage of frustrating political gadgets, unquote. After the appalling bloodshed, really appalling, of a civil war that had more to do with states' rights against the central government than with slavery, which most people don't understand. It wasn't about slavery. It became about slavery as a central moral cause. But the original American Revolution was about states' rights. Look, you may not agree with our right to hold slaves, so you don't have to in your state. You don't have to have slavery. But this is our state. Don't tell us what to do, whether you agree with it or not. That was got the Civil War going, and eventually we know that it got tethered to the wagon of anti-slavery movement, which was a good thing in the long run. Although many people at the time said not such a good thing to free millions of ignorant people who can't even read or write, and as far as they were concerned, couldn't even think straight or properly or in a sophisticated, mature way, and give them the vote. You're asking for trouble. So it became a huge problem in the minds of the South, and not a small one. So, as I say, it all seemed to signal a conclusive breakdown, not only of American federalism, but also of American democracy. The Canadians wanted something better. A parliamentary government in the British tradition, with a strong cabinet to lead it, was to be the thing, though many would have preferred that Canada avoid altogether the problem of trying to reconcile provincial powers, we have 10 provinces, with central powers in a so-called federation. We call it a confederation. They preferred a unitary state, or a so-called legislative union, such as the British enjoyed then, and they still enjoy today. Others wished ardently to protect provincial powers from central authority, and as with all federations, the debate over the legitimacy of the different powers, central power, provincial power, and so on, has never ceased. But owing to the vast region in need of government, Canada, you can fly 7 hours from one side of Canada to the other and still not get to the other side, but almost. But owing to the vast region in need of government and the intractable problems of protecting French-Canadian political power and identity, they opted for a federal system with enumerated and divided powers. Listen up. Though even that precaution has failed to prevent vast encroachments of one of the larger power on the smaller ones in Canada called provinces. In contrast to the United States, however, and this is really important, where all unspecified powers are left to the states, the individual states, in Canada, they fall to the central government, along with various other rights of disallowance and intrusion into the provinces. Canadians wanted constitutional liberty, not democracy. Now, I want to explain briefly the difference between the U.S. and Canada. Both of them had their founding documents, but if something new came up, for example, the so-called abortion right, which didn't exist then as a political thing or topic in America or Canada, who's supposed to decide who gets that right? Well, in America, they said each state gets the right. These are called the residual powers, or the powers which came to be after the Constitution was formed and for which there was no amendment or anything else and no law to govern it. Who decides? Americans said, we the people do in our individual states. Canada said, no, the central government does, not the provinces. So that's the difference between these two Atlantic democracies. They're one of the key ones. The new Canadian federal system, informed and improved as it was by the lessons of the ancients, and especially by the warnings of the American experience, was to be a departure even from British traditions of government, a unique form of government, a refined federalist concession to geography and to the French presence in Canada that all founders accepted as necessary, but a single nation in the end. Now I'm about to close. This part is called a return to Plato's Republic. In less than a century, however, the Canadian experience, much like the American one, turned upside down. I say it turned turtle. You flip the turtle. His legs were wobbling in the air, but he can't get back. He's still on his back. By the mid to late 1960s, already fattened on post-war economic growth and the tax harvest that made this possible, Canada plunged headlong into the arms of a sweet-sounding welfare state ideology, first tentatively under Prime Minister Lester Pearson, and then aggressively under the leadership of the strongman Pierre Trudeau, who was the father of our present Prime Minister, who's pretty boy, very verbally adept, but a weakling compared to his father, against whom I published my first book called The Trouble with Canada, just because I was a citizen who didn't like what he was doing to my country, which I'm explaining here. And I'm boasting a bit to say it was a big surprise to everybody in this country. That book sold almost 60,000 copies, and it became #1 in Canada 3 months after it was published. But after that, all the left-wingers knew who I was. And everything I wrote after that, I had a hard time finding a publisher, really. And there's no conservative publishers left in Canada today. Like, if I wrote a book today, I cannot find a publisher in Canada who would look at my arguments seriously. I have to go to the U.S. or to some other, English-speaking country. So in the space of a generation, Canada was transformed from a quiet, traditionalist nation with very little debt. We had almost 20 million or 20 billion in debt, or 10 billion, something like that, at the turn of the 20th century. Now it's like 400 or 500 billion or 600 billion, just counting the federal debt. And if you add to that provincial debts, such as they are, because they're not allowed to run deficits, but then all what we call the unfunded liabilities of the central government, which comes to many more trillions, I mean, it's unconscionable. And I always refer to public debt as a form of deferred taxation on future generations. I think it's one of the greatest moral defects of all the modern democracies. If you have a huge debt that you can't pay off in your own generation, you are downloading that duty on future generations who are not here today to defend themselves against your damn appetites. That's a scandal, a moral scandal. In any way you look at it, it cannot be defended. Well, one of my dear friends tried to defend it. He said, well, what about the roads and the bridges? I said, well, if you create something of value which can pass on to them for their use, that's a little bit of a different story. But most of these debts are not like that. It's just government overspending for its own purposes and to sweeten the pie they want the people to eat so they can get their votes. I think it's a scandal. So anyway, in the space of a generation, Canada was transformed, as I say, from a quiet traditionalist nation with very little debt into one of the most radically socialist and per capita one of the most highly indebted nations in the history of the world. That was true when I was writing this book, and it's maybe slightly better today, but not much if you take into consideration what I called unfunded liabilities of governments, like pensions, welfare systems, medical care, and all the rest of it, which are now the rights of the people. The founders' vision of provinces, individual provinces with limited but constitutionally protected powers of their own, surviving on their own credit, by the way, was rapidly smothered by grandiose and, frankly, unconstitutional central financing schemes that by fiscal bribery, by that I mean you accept central rule out there in the provinces, and we'll help you pay your expenses if you just vote for what we're proposing. We'll tax the people. We have the rights to tax them, but you don't have. So we'll tax the hell out of them and get done what we want done, and we'll pay half of your expenses while we do it. Now, this was forced on all the provinces, a vision of a universal social and redistributionist program controlled from the center, because Canada is not a unitary state. So Trudeau Sr. had to figure out how to do this. So, for example, in the case of so-called free medical care, and as I always say to my kids, and nothing is free, and don't forget it, and nothing is free, it's prepaid. Okay, Dad, they get it. But the way he did that with our provinces was he basically said, I, the central government, have the power to tax the people as a whole, everybody in the country, increasingly, like beyond what I'm doing now. And if you accept my program for universal medical care, coast to coast, province by province, same standards everywhere, I will pay half your expenses. Well, some of the provinces did, and some of them didn't. But the ones that refused, a year later, 2 years later, they caved in. And they came on board, and he got what he wanted, because billions of dollars was being put on the table, and they couldn't have it unless they agreed with his socialist program. And that's how Canada became a quasi-socialist state, through what I call fiscal bribery. But Plato was waiting in the wings. He made his entrance via Trudeau's Charter of Rights and Freedoms of 1982. One of those documents that's filled with abstract first principles, so dear to the hearts of all radicals, by the way, and French radicals in particular, it seems, ever since the French Revolution. It was the sort of document rightly feared by Canada's founders, because charters, now listen up here, this is the most important statement in this part of my little lecture. Because charters, all charters and constitutions that are written are not self-interpreting. In other words, they don't tell you what they mean. Not really. They try. America's founders thought they were doing a good job of telling the citizens what their rights were, but they just don't answer a lot of questions that get raised afterwards. In other words, they're not self-interpreting. They have to be interpreted by who? They always end up being interpreted by those who've won the struggle for political power, mostly by the courts. Sure enough, from the moment this document hit the floor, Canada's founding tradition of parliamentary sovereignty, the rule of the people, as the highest law and authority in the land, was supplanted by judicial sovereignty. It was an act of what's the word I'm looking for? It was an act of supplanting the power of the people by the rule of judges. So the voice of the elected people in Parliament was now subordinated to the opinions of unelected judges, because the abstract charter was now declared the supreme law of the land, quote unquote. Not the voice of the people, which was always considered the supreme law of Canada. And in England, the voice of their parliament is still called the supreme law of Britain and of England. But in Canada, it's not true. That went out the window as soon as Trudeau Sr. adopted this charter and got the Queen to sign it. So no law passed by Canada's parliament could infringe on these promissory abstract rights. I say promissory because no one really knows what they really mean. For example, it's full of words like equality, liberty and equality. It's called Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But you ask anybody in a room, intelligent people in a room, what's the definition of a right? What's the definition of a freedom? And they'll all start arguing, especially if there's a lot of beer around the table. But very few will agree, at least not in a short period of time, on what these words mean. However, only a judge, as I say, could decide if there actually is an infringement of any of the abstract principles in these documents. And thus, Canada's Supreme Court justices, educated in law schools with a generally modern liberal bent, became the supreme philosopher kings and queens, or gatekeepers of the nation's laws. That's why I said Plato was waiting in the wings. That's what he wanted in his republic, was philosopher kings. Okay, where thus Canada's Supreme Court justices, educated in law schools, became our philosopher kings and queens, or gatekeepers of the nation's laws. Some judges welcomed this, and some did not. And I know you've gone through this in Israel recently. I don't know where it all fell out, but I know you've been going through it. But all were aware that they had moved, listen up, beyond interpreting the law, and were now in a position to make the law by dressing abstract principles in clothing of their own legal choosing and their own moral choosing. Canada's new charter had converted its judges into legislators. Now, historically speaking, this meant the very end of the founders' dream of responsible government, simply because parliamentarians would thenceforth be obedient to appointed judges above than to the people below. Just as in the past, legislators in Canada had been responsible to the English Parliament overseas rather than to the Canadian people they governed. This change is especially visible today whenever judges brazenly order, get this, they order a parliament or a Congress, in the case of the U.S., to create a specific kind of law. These are orders which are unthinkable under a system maintaining sovereignty of the people. Sovereignty of the people is out the window once you go to charter law and charter rule. So it must surely seem ironic that the Constitution is designed by both the Canadian and the American founders, as they struggled, quote, valiantly to protect their peoples from the tyranny of democracy, have ended up legitimizing judicial tyranny, unquote. In the long run, all governments, this is just my view, in the long run, all governments of no matter what kind tend to become oligarchies by whatever name. So this is the end of my little talk on what happened to Athenian and Roman democracy when they fell into the hands of North Americans. And so now you get the picture. In the next lecture, which would be in 2 weeks' time, I want to talk about another, I think, very interesting topic called freedom, democracy, and slavery. It's about the connection between slavery and democracy. And anybody who thinks about, oh, here's that phrase is going to say, what do you mean, slavery and democracy? Democracy is specifically about not being a slave. Well, you'll see when I get to it how much of this thinking is going on in the history of the evolution of democracy in the Western world and its connection with slavery, not just chattel slavery, but also tax slavery, which we all have a huge experience now, unfortunately. I say this because I think just before the First World War, Canada had no income tax. Neither did America. I don't know about your country, but today, if you tell somebody that, they're almost in shock. What do you mean no income tax? How could you run a country without an income tax? And I say, well, you had sales taxes, you had import taxes, and you had all that kind of thing. But our ancestors considered it a moral rupture, a real moral problem to tax human work. Why would you tax work? You want people to work more and be more productive, not to work less. As soon as you start taxing them, they earn less from their labor and they become discouraged. And not only that, but you start using the money that you're grabbing from their work, which our ancestors considered completely immoral and completely unethical. and you turn around and offer them things that they used to provide for themselves and for their families and for their villages, and you deprive them of their responsibilities. So anyway, you'll see where this is going when I get to it in 2 weeks. Thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your next episode. I think it will be very interesting, especially what you just mentioned now. It's hard to believe that the income tax did not exist until 1913 in the US, and you said the same about Canada. Yes. We can't imagine now, a country without it.
No, well, governments, as I will explain, they had other ways of getting, let's call it value from their citizens. For example, something called the corvée, which I will describe, was a way of requiring all able-bodied males in particular, women were not usually included, to work for the government for 2 weeks building roads in England and Scotland, for example, and in Canada and France. The corvée was quite common. People were happy to pitch in for a couple of weeks, but it wasn't like some kind of burden which hung over their heads all year long, like we have today. So it's going to be interesting to talk about this and to discuss the difference between those ways for governments to relate to their people. I mean, it's really shocking. My historian friend, I should have him on the show sometime. Well, I'll talk about it when I get to it, but he tells me that even monarchs in England, for example, up until very recently, had no right to enter the private home of an Englishman. No legal right, no nothing. They would cause a riot in the village if they tried to do that, or to send their men into a private home. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I heard about it.
Yeah, and even the Lord Mayor of London, you needed the permission of the Lord Mayor of London for the King or the Queen to enter the city of London.
Wow.
So things are a little different than what we think they were. So it's my great pleasure to chat with you in a while about that too.
Thank you very much. And I'm also looking forward to the lecture about the French Revolution when it's possible.
That'll take me a while to put together, but I'd be happy to do it. I have spent a lot of my adult life thinking and reading about it. And yeah, it's, I think I mentioned to you the Chinese statesman who was asked, and I agree with him, he was asked very seriously by an historian, a few years ago, whatever, what do you think of the impact of the French Revolution on modern life? You know what he said? He said, it's too soon to tell. And I agree with him. We're still feeling the impact of that revolution almost in our every word about these topics. Mm-hmm. So, salut, as they say.
William, if you don't mind, if you can write tomorrow or when you have a little bit free time, a description so I can attach it to the recording?
Yeah, you'll get it tomorrow. Hopefully I can get it done before noon of my time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, William.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
For having us.
See you next time.
Yeah.